It was a cold spring morning in 1945 when the train carrying the first group of German female prisoners of war finally arrived at Camp Alona in Iowa. The women stepped off the train, weary from the long journey, their uniforms tattered from months of captivity, and their faces etched with exhaustion. The sky above them was a dull gray, matching the heaviness in their hearts. They had been prepared for the worst, having heard the rumors and stories of how American camps treated their prisoners. They expected brutality, cruelty, and inhumane conditions, but what awaited them was far different than anything they could have imagined. The first thing that struck them was the clean and orderly camp. The barracks were well kept, with freshly made beds and neatly stacked blankets. The women's eyes scanned their new surroundings, searching for signs of the suffering they had been promised. Instead of barbed wire fences and watchtowers, they saw wide, open spaces and well-maintained buildings. It was nothing like the overcrowded, filthy camps they had been in before. The American soldiers, though keeping their distance, treated them with respect, guiding them toward their designated quarters without any sign of aggression. For a brief moment, there was a sense of relief among the women. Perhaps the stories they had heard were exaggerated. Maybe, just maybe, this would not be as terrible as they had feared. But this sense of ease was fleeting. The reality of their situation was slowly starting to sink in. They were prisoners, and no matter how different the camp seemed, their fate was still in the hands of their captors. They still had no idea what would happen next, but for the moment, they had a chance to rest and recover from the long journey.
After settling into their quarters, the women were escorted to the mess hall for their first meal in American captivity. They entered the dining hall cautiously, eyes darting around to assess the situation. The room was simple but clean, with long wooden tables and benches. The scent of food lingered in the air, something they had not had the luxury of smelling in a long time. Their stomachs growled in anticipation, but there was a sense of nervousness among them. Would the food be different? Would it be edible? More importantly, would it be enough to fill their empty stomachs?
When they were finally served, their eyes widened in disbelief. On their plates was a strange, golden square, something they had never seen before. The camp cook, a tall African-American man named Sam Washington, stood nearby, watching their reactions. He had prepared cornbread as a special treat for the new arrivals, something he believed would make them feel more at home. But as the women looked at the cornbread, their faces twisted in confusion. They had no idea what it was. They whispered to each other in rapid German, trying to make sense of it. To them, it looked nothing like bread, and certainly not like anything they had eaten in the past. Their leader, Greta, was the first to speak out. She held up a piece of the cornbread, examining it closely before turning to the others with a bemused expression. "It's not even bread," she said in a loud voice, her words echoing across the hall. The other women burst into laughter, their amusement at the strange food palpable. They had expected something more familiar, something that would remind them of home, but this was something entirely different. The laughter was not cruel, but it was genuine, born from a mix of confusion and disbelief. Sam's face fell at their reaction. He had meant the cornbread as a gesture of goodwill, a small token of welcome to make the women feel more comfortable, but instead of appreciation, he was met with mockery. His heart sank as he watched them laugh at his carefully prepared food. The guards, who had been observing the scene with mild interest, now shifted uncomfortably. The atmosphere in the mess hall changed in an instant. What had begun as an act of kindness now felt like an insult, and the tension in the room grew thick. Despite the discomfort in the air, the women continued to laugh. For them, it was a moment of lightness, a brief respite from the horrors of war. But it was clear that they had no idea just how important this food was, not only to the Americans, but to the survival of entire communities. Cornbread, made from cornmeal, had been a staple of survival for generations in America, particularly during times of scarcity. But the women had no way of knowing that. They had never encountered anything like it before, and they had no reason to understand its significance.
As the laughter subsided, Greta looked around at her fellow prisoners, realizing that their behavior might have been seen as disrespectful. She felt a pang of guilt as she noticed the hurt in Sam's eyes. She had not meant to mock him, but in that moment it seemed impossible to understand the gravity of the situation. To them, the cornbread was just a strange, inedible food. But for Sam, it was more than that. It was a symbol of survival, of hope, and of resilience in the face of adversity. It was a food that had helped families endure the hardest of times. The incident with the cornbread would linger in the camp for days. The women's laughter had not only embarrassed Sam, but also created a rift between them and their American captors. The warm hospitality they had initially received now felt distant and cold. The guards, once friendly, became more reserved, and the women began to realize that their actions had consequences. The tension between the two groups grew, and what had once been a temporary respite from the war now seemed like a reminder of their captivity. But as the days passed, the women started to notice small changes in their behavior. They began to treat the American guards with more respect, understanding that the men and women who were watching over them were, in many ways, no different than they were. They were all prisoners of the war, bound by circumstances beyond their control. The tension in the camp began to ease, and the women slowly adjusted to their new reality. They were still prisoners, but they were no longer alone. The kindness, even in the form of something as simple as cornbread, had begun to bridge the gap between them and their captors, even if just a little. The next day, the women were given a new task: to learn the routines of the camp. It was a necessary step, one that would teach them the rules of their new life, and in some ways, make them feel more integrated into the American system. As they walked through the camp with the guards, the women noticed a building they had not seen before. It was an ordinary-looking structure from the outside, but as they approached it, they could hear the sounds of machines humming softly from within. The sign above the door read, "Laundry," but none of them had any idea what that meant. They entered the building in small groups, unsure of what they were about to witness. Inside, they were greeted by the sight of large metal machines lined up against the walls. There were washtubs, dryers, and strange contraptions with buttons and levers. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. Back in Germany, they had been used to washing their clothes by hand, scrubbing them against rough rocks, or using the traditional washboards. The thought of machines doing the work for them was almost incomprehensible. At first, the women stood in stunned silence, staring at the machines. Their eyes flicked from one to the other, trying to make sense of what they were looking at. It wasn't just the size of the machines that overwhelmed them, but the sheer idea that these machines could do so much work in such a short time. The concept of having clean clothes without spending hours of labor felt like a luxury. It was almost as though they were seeing the future, something they had only dreamed about. A camp worker, a young woman named Helen, approached the group and began to explain how everything worked. She pointed to the washing machines first, showing the women how clothes were placed inside, and then how the machines would agitate the water and soap to clean the fabric. For the women, the idea that a machine could perform such a task was foreign. They were used to spending hours by hand, using old-fashioned tools to scrub dirt out of their clothing. The thought of not having to bend over a washtub or scrub tirelessly with their hands was almost too much to process. One of the women, Liesel, stepped forward and tentatively placed a piece of clothing into one of the machines. She watched, transfixed, as it began to spin, the fabric slowly disappearing into the large metal drum. The sound of the water rushing and the spinning motion were mesmerizing, almost hypnotic. It was as though Liesel had never seen something so magical in her life.
Her face lit up with a look of awe, and a few of the other women gathered around to watch as well. For them, this was no longer just a laundry room. It had become a symbol of the unknown and a glimpse into a world they had never imagined. Helen then showed them the dryers, which worked in a similar way. Clothes were placed inside, and the machine blew hot air to dry them in a fraction of the time it would take if they were hung out to dry. Again, the women's amazement was palpable. In Germany, the process was slow and tedious. Clothes were washed by hand, wrung out, and then hung on clotheslines to dry, regardless of the weather. The idea that machines could not only wash clothes, but dry them as well, seemed almost too good to be true. As the women stood there, each absorbed in their own thoughts, they began to realize just how much work these machines would save them. What had been a grueling, exhausting task now seemed simple. They had always been taught that life was about hard work, sacrifice, and endurance. The American way of doing things, with its machines and technology, was an entirely different philosophy. It was as if they had been given a glimpse into a future where labor wasn't just about physical toil, but about efficiency and ease. Greta, the unofficial leader of the group, was particularly struck by the concept. She had always been the one to keep morale high, to remind her fellow prisoners of the importance of patience and perseverance. But now, standing in the laundry room, she was beginning to question everything she had ever known. The machines were not just a convenience, they were a symbol of a different way of living, a way of life that she had never thought possible. She had lived through the horrors of war, the long, exhausting days of captivity, and the constant fear of death. And yet, here she was, standing in a laundry room that seemed to offer a glimmer of hope. The other women were equally mesmerized by the machines, but some of them felt a sense of unease. They had been conditioned to believe that anything that made life easier was a luxury they didn't deserve. They had been taught that survival came through hardship, that the more difficult the task, the more meaningful the outcome. And yet, here were these machines that promised to make their lives easier without any effort on their part. It was difficult for them to accept that something as simple as laundry could be done for them by a machine. As the day went on, the women began to experiment with the machines. They took turns loading clothes into the washers and dryers, each woman fascinated by the process. There was laughter and chatter as they helped each other, some speaking in broken English, others in their native German. The air was filled with a sense of excitement, as if they were discovering a secret world. The sound of the machines whirring and humming became a soundtrack to their newfound sense of wonder. But despite the excitement, there was also an underlying feeling of sadness. For all the technological marvels around them, the women knew that they were still prisoners. They were still in captivity, still at the mercy of their captors. The laundry machines, as wonderful as they were, couldn't change that. They couldn't erase the pain of the war, the separation from their families, or the uncertainty of their future. And yet, for a brief moment, the machines offered a sense of normalcy, a reminder of the simple comforts that had been stripped away from them during the war. As the day ended and the women returned to their quarters, they carried with them not just clean clothes, but a new understanding of what was possible. The laundry room had become a symbol of the possibilities that lay ahead, a reminder that even in the darkest times there could be moments of light. The machines, once a source of confusion and amazement, had become a symbol of resilience, of the human ability to adapt and survive even in the face of adversity. The days following their discovery of the laundry room passed with a sense of unease. Despite their initial awe at the machines, a feeling of discomfort lingered among the German women. They had spent years living through the hardships of war, constantly reminded of their struggles and the weight of their survival. The laundry room, with its efficient machines and clean surroundings, seemed like an alien world, one that they were both drawn to and repelled by.
In Germany, the act of washing clothes had been something personal, a chore that connected them to their past, their families, and their memories of normal life before the war. But here, in this foreign land, it felt as if that connection was being stripped away.
As the women began to use the machines more frequently, they started to notice the contrast between their lives in captivity and their lives before the war. Back in Germany, laundry had been an arduous task, done by hand and often in the cold, with only rudimentary tools to help. They would spend hours scrubbing their clothes in freezing water, drying them on lines in the wind, and hoping they would be dry by the time night fell. The simplicity of the task in the laundry room, however, was almost unsettling. The machines worked with precision, washing and drying the clothes with little effort on their part. It felt like an easy way out, as if they had been deprived of the dignity of manual labor that had once defined their lives.
Liesel, the youngest of the group, was the first to speak up about the strange feeling that had settled over them. She had grown up in a small village where every task, no matter how mundane, was carried out with a sense of purpose. Laundry, like cooking or cleaning, had been something that brought the family together. But here, in the camp, it felt like the machines were doing everything for them, leaving them with nothing to do but watch. There was no pride in the work, no sense of accomplishment. It was as though they had become passive observers in their own lives, and the machines were the ones in control.
Greta, who had been the unofficial leader of the group since their arrival, listened to Liesel's concerns with a heavy heart. She understood the unease that her fellow prisoners were feeling, but she also knew that this was the reality of their situation. The war had taken so much from them, their homes, their families, their sense of identity. And now it seemed as if the machines were taking away their last connection to the world they had once known. In their old lives, even the simplest tasks had been infused with meaning. But now that meaning felt hollow, replaced by the sterile efficiency of technology. Greta found herself questioning what they had become, what they were turning into in this new world.
Despite their discomfort, the women continued to use the machines, reluctantly at first, but eventually with more confidence. They had no choice. The camp had imposed the new routine, and resisting it would only make their lives more difficult. The camp staff encouraged them to use the laundry room as often as possible, and soon the women found themselves spending more time there, washing their clothes and feeling the strange sense of detachment that came with the task. They would stand in front of the machines, watching the clothes spin and tumble, their minds wandering to other places. In those moments, they tried to forget the horrors they had experienced and the uncertainty that lay ahead. The machines became a temporary escape, a place where they could focus on something simple and routine, even if it felt like a hollow victory. One afternoon, as the women were using the laundry room, Sam Washington, the camp cook, walked in to check on the machines. He had noticed the women's unease and had been quietly observing their interactions with the machines. His work in the kitchen had become a refuge for him, a place where he could channel his grief and pain into something productive. He had heard the women's laughter when they first encountered the cornbread, and he had felt the sting of their mockery. But now, as he watched them in the laundry room, he saw something different. He saw a group of women who were struggling to adapt to a world that had been turned upside down, a world where the familiar tasks of daily life had been taken away from them. Sam stood by the machines, watching as the women worked in silence. He could sense the tension in the room, the way they were trying to adjust to this new way of life. He understood their discomfort. He had seen it before in the eyes of soldiers who had returned from the front lines, broken and unsure of how to move forward. He had seen it in the faces of refugees who had fled their homes, unsure of where they belonged. And now he was seeing it in the German women, who had come to America as prisoners, but were slowly being shown that there was another way to live, a way that did not involve constant struggle and survival. As he watched them, Sam felt a pang of empathy. He understood the weight of loss and the difficulty of adjusting to a new reality. The machines, though they offered convenience, could never replace the personal connection that came from doing things by hand. He thought of his own mother, who had always washed clothes with love, making sure each garment was clean and pressed. It wasn't just about getting the clothes clean, it was about caring for them, about showing that even in the simplest of tasks there was love and attention to detail. Sam knew that the women in the camp needed something more than just clean clothes. They needed to feel connected to the world again. The next day, Sam returned to the laundry room with an idea. He brought with him a basket of old clothes that needed mending. The women, curious about what he was doing, watched as he began to carefully stitch up the seams of a torn short. He moved with the kind of precision and care that made the task look effortless. As he worked, he explained to the women that sometimes it was the small acts of care, like mending a tear or sewing on a button, that gave a garment value. It wasn't about the machine doing the work for them, it was about the love and attention that went into each stitch. Sam invited the women to join him, to take the time to mend their own clothes, and to remember that even in captivity they could still find meaning in the simple acts of life. At first, the women hesitated. They had become so accustomed to the machines doing everything for them that the thought of returning to manual labor seemed strange. But as they watched Sam work, something shifted in them. Slowly, one by one, they began to pick up their clothes and start mending them. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They realized that by taking the time to repair their clothes, they were not just restoring their garments, they were restoring a part of themselves that had been lost in the chaos of war. For the first time since their arrival, the women began to feel a sense of pride in their work, even if it was as simple as sewing a button. In that moment, the laundry room, once a symbol of their disconnection from the past, became a place of healing. The machines were still there, still humming away in the background, but they no longer held the same power over the women. They had found a way to take back control, to find meaning in the small acts that made up their daily lives. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time since their arrival at the camp, the women felt like they were starting to rebuild, not just their lives, but their sense of dignity as well. As the weeks went by, the women's routine in the camp settled into a strange rhythm, a mixture of necessity and forced acceptance. The laundry room, which had once been a source of awe and discomfort, had become just another part of their daily lives. They no longer hesitated when it was time to wash their clothes. The machines, once a symbol of their disconnection from their past, had become tools they now relied on. Yet, despite this new sense of routine, something deeper remained unsettled within them. They had adapted to the machines, to the easier way of doing things, but they had not yet reconciled it with the values they had carried with them from their old lives. Greta, who had always been the voice of calm leadership, found herself struggling with the quiet dissonance between what she had learned to endure and what she was now being asked to accept. She often found herself alone in her quarters, staring out of the small window at the fields beyond the camp, trying to make sense of the new world she was living in. In her mind, the war had always been about survival, about fighting for dignity, even in the darkest of times. But here, in this camp, it felt as if they were being asked to let go of that fight. The machines, the food, the routines, all of it seemed to strip away the very essence of what had made them who they were. Liesel, who had initially embraced the idea of using the machines, began to grow frustrated with the ease of it all. At first, it had felt like a dream, something simple, something that made life easier. But now, it felt like a reminder of everything they had lost. The camp had taken away their homes, their families, and their country. Now, it seemed as though it was trying to take away their sense of purpose as well. She missed the days when hard work had given her a sense of accomplishment, when each task, no matter how small, had been an expression of who she was. The machines made everything too easy, too sterile. It was as though they were no longer needed in the same way, and that left her feeling empty.
The other women shared Liesel's frustration in varying degrees. Some, like Marlene, seemed to accept their new lives without question. They were grateful for the food, the clean barracks, and the lack of violence they had feared so much. For them, the machines were simply a part of the comfort that had come with their captivity. But others, like Helena, could not shake the feeling that they were losing something essential. Helena had always been one of the most resourceful women in the group, and she felt that the machines were taking away her ability to be self-reliant. It wasn't just the laundry that bothered her, it was everything. The food, the cleanliness, the routines, everything was provided for them. It felt as though they had no control over their own lives anymore.
Greta, aware of the growing tension among her fellow prisoners, decided to have a meeting with the women in their barracks. She knew that they needed to talk about what they were feeling, to process the emotions that were building up inside. When they gathered that evening, there was a heaviness in the air, an unspoken understanding that things were not as simple as they appeared. They sat in a circle, the dim light from a single lamp casting long shadows across their faces. "I know many of you are struggling," Greta began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We've been here for weeks now, and it's easy to let the routines of this place define us. But we must not forget who we are. We are not just prisoners, not just women with nothing left. We are still human, and we must hold on to that." There was a quiet pause as the women listened. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked down at their hands, unsure of how to respond. Greta continued, speaking of the importance of preserving their sense of dignity, of not letting the ease of their captivity take away their agency. It was a message of hope, but also of resistance, the kind of quiet rebellion that comes from holding on to your identity even when the world around you is trying to strip it away.
Helena, who had been quiet up until that point, finally spoke. "But how do we hold on to that when everything here is so easy?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "I don't feel like I'm doing anything. The machines do it all for us. We don't even have to wash our own clothes anymore. We don't have to struggle for anything. It's like we've lost the right to fight for something."
Her words hung in the air, and the other women nodded slowly, understanding the frustration behind them. It was not that they were ungrateful for the comforts they had been given, but they felt disconnected from the effort and struggle that had once defined their lives. They had always fought for something, whether it was survival, dignity, or the hope of returning home. But here, in the camp, everything was handed to them on a silver platter, and they didn't know how to reconcile that with their past experiences.
Greta took a deep breath, her heart heavy with the weight of their words. "I understand," she said softly, "but we must remember that we are still living. We still have each other, and we still have the power to make choices, even in this place. The machines may do the work for us, but we still have the ability to decide how we use our time, how we treat one another, and how we keep our dignity intact." Her words were met with silence, but it was a thoughtful silence. The women understood what she was saying, but they also knew that it wasn't easy. The machines had changed everything, and they didn't know how to navigate this new world. But they were beginning to understand that their struggle was no longer just about surviving physically. It was about surviving emotionally, about holding on to their sense of self in a world that was trying to take it from them. The next few days passed in a quiet haze. The women went about their daily routines, using the machines to wash their clothes, eat the meals provided to them, and participate in the camp's activities. But there was a subtle shift in the air. They began to talk more openly about their frustrations, their doubts, and their hopes. They spent time together, knitting, reading, and sharing stories from their pasts. It was a small act of rebellion, a way of resisting the ease of their captivity. They were still human, still capable of feeling, of connecting, and of holding on to their identity, even in the face of a world that seemed determined to take it away. As the days turned into weeks, the women began to adapt to their new life in a way that was less about accepting the machines and more about finding a balance between what they had lost and what they had gained. They understood that they could not change the fact that they were prisoners, but they could control how they responded to it. They could still find meaning in their daily lives, even in the most mundane tasks. The laundry machines, once a symbol of their disconnection, became a reminder that they could still find value in the small acts of life, even if they were no longer the ones doing all the work. As the weeks continued to pass in the camp, a subtle change began to take place within the group of women. What had once been an unfamiliar and unsettling routine, using the laundry machines, relying on the camp's provided food, and living under the watchful eyes of their captors, began to feel somewhat normalized. Yet the women still carried a weight with them, an unspoken tension that made them feel disconnected from the lives they had known before the war. The ease of their existence in the camp, though a relief in many ways, had started to feel hollow. There was no challenge, no sense of struggle to overcome. They were simply existing. And for many of them, that lack of purpose began to feel like its own form of captivity. It was Greta who first noticed the shift. She had always been the one to keep spirits high, to remind everyone that survival meant resilience. But lately, even she found herself struggling with the emptiness of it all. The laundry room, once a source of fascination, had now become just another place to pass time. The routine, while easy, had no meaning beyond the basic necessity of it. There was no effort required, no accomplishment felt at the end of each task. And without that sense of achievement, they began to lose sight of what it meant to truly live. Greta shared her concerns with the group one evening after a day of performing the same menial tasks. They sat in their barracks, the flickering light from a small lamp casting shadows on the walls. "I know we're all tired," she began, her voice steady, "but we need to find something here, something more than just getting through each day. We've been given this comfort, yes, but comfort alone isn't enough. It doesn't fill the emptiness." The women listened, their eyes focused on Greta as she spoke. For the first time, they all understood that their struggle was no longer about survival alone. It was about finding meaning in the mundane, about reclaiming a part of themselves that had been lost. The following days saw a slow shift. Greta proposed that they start small projects, things that would give their time more purpose. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They began by organizing the clothes they had washed, folding them neatly and finding small ways to add a personal touch to the task. They started to see the act of folding as something more than a chore. It was a way of taking pride in their own small part of the camp, a way of making their mark in a place where they had so little control. Liesel, who had once found the machines strange and uncomfortable, began to embrace the idea of making something more of their daily routine. She suggested that they use their time to learn new skills. Some of the women started reading English books, while others focused on improving their language skills by practicing speaking with the guards. The idea was not to let their minds become as idle as their hands had become, but to actively engage with the world around them, to break through the monotony with knowledge and learning. The women also began to work together in other ways. They held impromptu lessons on everything from history to literature, topics that had once been part of their daily lives but now felt distant. Greta often took the lead, teaching what she remembered from her time as a schoolteacher in Hamburg. The other women contributed when they could, each offering their own expertise, whether it was mathematics, geography, or even practical knowledge like how to repair clothes. The knowledge they shared with one another became a vital thread, weaving them together in a way that made them feel more connected to their pasts, more connected to who they had been before the war. Though their days in the camp were still governed by the rules and routines set by the American officers, the women began to reclaim a sense of autonomy. They found purpose in their lessons, in the small acts of care they showed one another, in the conversations that filled the evenings. It was not much, but it was a way of fighting back against the numbness that had taken root. They realized that while they might not have control over their circumstances, they still had control over their actions, their thoughts, and their ability to find meaning in the simplest moments.
As they adapted to this new way of life, the women began to notice changes in their relationships with the American soldiers. Initially, there had been a palpable distance between the prisoners and their captors. But over time, that distance started to narrow. The women, especially Greta, had learned to speak in more measured terms with the guards, asking them about their families, their lives before the war. Some of the soldiers, like Corporal James Mitchell, who had first shown them how to play card games, became regular figures in their daily routines. Though the soldiers still maintained their professionalism, there was a subtle shift in their interactions. The women were no longer just prisoners. They were people, individuals with stories and lives outside of the camp. But even as they began to bond with the guards, the women were careful not to let go of the lessons they had learned in the past. They knew that the comfort they were experiencing could not erase the reality of their situation. They were still prisoners, and the war was still raging. They understood that while they could create small moments of meaning in their lives, those moments were temporary, and the larger world outside the camp still held their fate. Greta, as their leader, continued to encourage the women to hold on to their dignity, to maintain their humanity despite the circumstances. She reminded them that they were more than their uniforms, more than their status as prisoners. They were people with histories, with dreams, with the ability to adapt and persevere. And while the camp might strip away everything else, it could never take away their inner strength. The days in the camp became a mix of learning, reflection, and quiet rebellion against the ease of their existence. The women were slowly rebuilding their sense of purpose, finding meaning in the simplest of tasks. They had learned to embrace the challenges that came with their captivity, not the ones of survival, but the ones of reclaiming their humanity. It was an uncertain path, but it was a path nonetheless, and with each step they took, they were more certain of their ability to endure, to find meaning, and to remember who they had been before the war. By the time winter had fully arrived at Camp Alona, the women had settled into a routine that, while still far from normal, had allowed them to regain a sense of dignity. The harsh Iowa cold made the days feel longer, the wind cutting through the barracks with a relentless chill, but the women had found warmth in each other's company. Despite the confines of their captivity, they had managed to carve out small spaces of normalcy, through learning, small acts of care, and the shared experiences that had begun to bind them together. Yet beneath this fragile peace, there was an undercurrent of tension. The camp's ease had begun to feel like a kind of quiet imprisonment, one that threatened to erase their sense of struggle, of self-reliance, and their ability to endure. They knew they had survived the horrors of war and captivity, but now they were fighting a different battle, the battle for meaning in a world where nothing felt earned. Greta, who had initially believed that survival was enough, began to question whether survival alone could truly bring them peace. It wasn't just about getting through each day anymore. It was about finding something to fight for, something to live for beyond the mechanical routine they had fallen into. She saw it in the other women too, the moment when comfort started to feel like a form of surrender. Even though they had found solace in the daily rhythms of camp life, there was still a quiet, nagging realization that something essential had been lost in the ease of their captivity. They had been stripped of the fight, the struggle that had once defined their existence. Now they were prisoners of comfort. It was during one of these moments of reflection that Greta realized they needed to reclaim their power, to restore the agency they had once held. The women, she knew, were capable of more than just surviving the monotony of the camp. They were capable of living fully, even in the face of captivity. But to do so, they had to actively resist the pull of complacency that had begun to take hold of them. They had to fight for meaning, not just passively accept the easy comfort that came with their captivity. Greta proposed a new project to the women, one that would allow them to re-engage with their humanity in a meaningful way. "Let's create something," she suggested one evening, her voice quiet but filled with resolve. "Let's use our hands to make something that matters to us, something that will remind us who we are." The idea was simple, yet powerful. They would use the materials available to them, scraps of fabric, thread, and even old newspapers, to create something tangible, something they could hold in their hands and feel proud of. It wasn't about the final product, it was about the act of creation itself, about the power of turning nothing into something. At first, the women were hesitant. They had been so used to the machines doing all the work for them, to the idea that everything could be made easy and effortless. The thought of going back to handcrafting, of putting in effort and time into something small, felt strange to them. Yet, as Greta's idea began to take root, they started to see the value in it. This wasn't about creating something perfect. It was about creating something personal, something that was theirs, something that could not be made by machines or dictated by the camp's routines. The first project was simple, a quilt. Using the fabric scraps they had collected from their clothes, they began to stitch together pieces of cloth, each one representing a part of their journey. Some of the women added small personal symbols, stitches that formed shapes of birds, flowers, or even small phrases that had meaning for them. It wasn't just about creating warmth, it was about creating a tapestry of their experiences, their struggles, and their resilience. Each patch of fabric told a story, a silent testament to their endurance. As they worked, the women began to open up to each other in a way they hadn't before. The quiet act of sewing together, of focusing on something small and tangible, allowed them to share their stories, their memories of home, and the people they had lost. They spoke of their families, their hopes for the future, and the things they had left behind. In those moments, the camp felt a little less like a prison and a little more like a place where they could reconnect to the parts of themselves they had thought were gone forever. They were no longer just surviving, they were living, and they were reclaiming their agency, one stitch at a time. Even the guards, who had always kept their distance, began to notice the change. It wasn't just the quilt they saw, it was the shift in the women's behavior. They were no longer passive, no longer waiting for the day to end. They were actively engaging with their environment, making it their own in ways that the camp had not intended. The guards began to speak more to the women, asking questions about the quilt and the other small projects they had begun. There was a newfound respect between the two groups, though it was still carefully guarded by the boundaries of their roles as captor and captive. But it was enough to break the ice, to make the women feel seen as more than just prisoners. As the quilt grew, so did the women's sense of identity. They began to take pride in their work, not because it was perfect or useful, but because it was theirs. It was a quiet rebellion against the monotony of their lives, a statement that they could still create, still find meaning in the small things, even in the most unlikely of places. The quilt became a symbol of their resilience, a reminder that they were more than the sum of their circumstances. They were women with stories, with hearts, with the ability to shape their world in small, powerful ways. By the time the quilt was finished, the women had transformed. They were no longer just prisoners of war. They were creators, artists, and survivors. They had rediscovered something vital within themselves, something they had feared lost forever in the tedium of their captivity. And though the camp remained the same, the women no longer felt as though it could take away everything from them. They had found a way to fight back, not with weapons or violence, but with their hands and their hearts. They had created something meaningful, something that was uniquely theirs, and in doing so, they had taken back their power.